Welcome everyone to the Peoria Riverfront Museum Senior Morning Lecture Series. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Heather Placco, the program manager, and I'm excited to be hosting H.P. Newquist, curator of our current guitar exhibition and the executive director of the National Guitar Museum. This Zoom presentation will be recorded and uploaded to the museum's YouTube account following the presentation. At the end of the presentation, HP will gladly answer any of your questions or comments you might have. Please feel free to type those comments or questions in the Q&A box or in the comment box below, and I will ask the questions for you. So without further hesitation, let's give a big welcome to HP Newquist.
Thank you, Heather. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank you, for attending on this fine Wednesday morning. And I want to thank Heather for hosting me. What we're going to talk about today is guitar, the instrument that rocked the world. It's the exhibition that we have there in Peoria, and it's there until January. So we highly recommend, if you get a chance, going out and seeing it in person. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the things that if we were on site together, I would show you maybe some of the trivia, some of the behind the scenes elements of the guitar and its history. And really we'll talk about why the guitar. And that's actually a great place to start. Why the guitar? Why an exhibit about the guitar? Well, first of all, the guitar is the world's most popular instrument. There are over 3 million guitars sold in the US every year. It's more than every other instrument combined. And so if you take all the pianos, all the drums and saxophones and flutophones and trumpets and trombones and violins and cellos, all together they don't add up to as many instruments sold per year as the guitar. And the guitar not only is popular, but it's an instrument that's been around for a long time. And its popularity is something that those of us of a certain age are very familiar with, especially for country music and rock and roll. But the question oftentimes comes up as I get ready to walk you through the exhibit, what makes the guitar so popular? Well, there are 3 things that separate the guitar, we think, from almost every other instrument. First of all, you can play it and sing with it at the same time. You can't do that with a flute or a violin. You can't do it with a saxophone or a trumpet. You can play them, but you can't sing at the same time. The second point is you can carry it with you. The guitar is a portable instrument. You can't easily carry around drums and you can't easily carry around pianos. When you combine that with the first one, you might be able to sing and play the piano at the same time, but you might not be able to carry the piano with you. And finally, and this is perhaps most important, the guitar is the only instrument that you have to hold next to you and that you don't reach out to play. And this is true actually for many stringed instruments that are relatives of the guitar. But when you think about keyboards, you've got to reach your fingers out. When you think about drums, you've got to reach out to hit the skins. When you think about the flute or the violin or any other woodwind or brass instrument, it's all about reaching away and holding your hands away from you. With the guitar, you're holding it next to your body. You actually feel it resonate against your rib cage, against your abdomen, and you really have to embrace it. And it's something that makes it a lot more personal than almost any other instrument. So when you have these 3 things together, we think it creates the perfect instrument and contributes to the fact that the guitar is the world's most popular instrument. So that leads us into, well, how long has the guitar been around? Our story starts in 3000 BC. And even though that seems like a very specific date, we know stringed instruments go back many, many years before that. We've got images of stringed instruments from before that, but the reason we date it to 3000 BC, which is 5,000 years ago, is that's really the beginning of recorded history. When we talk about prehistory or prehistoric times, that's before 3000 BC. And that's because we have no writing or glyphs that specifically tell us what was happening prior to that. We know human life was doing all kinds of great things and evolving and crafting everything from instruments to tools, but we don't have any written record of it prior to 3000 BC. So we really start our story here at 3000 BC. And that begins with a couple of instruments that were primarily found in the Middle East and Northern Africa. And you'll see they're two very different instruments, although they're early stringed instruments. The one on the left is the nyatiti. It's a bowl shaped, uses a big gourd, like a pumpkin gourd, along with strings, much like a lyre that you would have seen in perhaps Roman fables and Greek myths. To the right of that is the tambur, which is from the Middle East, and that has a very long neck and only a few strings. So on the left, you've got an instrument that has 8 strings, very short kind of neck. And then on the right, you have the tambur, which has a very long neck, but very few strings. And the nyatiti came from Eastern Africa. Tambur came from the Middle East, primarily Arabian Peninsula. But these are the first stringed instruments that we really look at as being precursors to the guitar. And you'll see examples of these along with everything else I show you in the exhibit itself. Those two instruments came together in what we consider the very first stepping off point for the guitar, which is the oud. And it's spelled O-U-D. It sounds like food, not ode or oud. It's just oud. And the oud was a round-backed instrument, still produced today, that had a very short neck, but very many strings. So it combined the best of those elements from Eastern Africa and those from the Middle East into an instrument that we can begin to recognize as something with a neck that we can put our fingers on and strings that we can play and strum. Now, it was a very, very popular instrument in Northern Africa. When the Moors, who were the Muslims from North America, made their way across the Strait of Gibraltar, they invaded the Iberian Peninsula. And the Iberian Peninsula is Portugal, Spain, and part of southern France. And they brought this instrument with them into Europe, and it became wildly popular. It was adapted by the local Iberians, so let's call them Spanish right now, and they created something that was called the lute. And if you take the word alud, which is a Middle Eastern name for that instrument, you say it quickly, it's lute, alud, lute. So the lute on the right was a very European derivation of the oud. It became so popular that it spread not only throughout the Iberian Peninsula, but deeper into Europe. And it was a little less ornate, but it was a little more practical. It had something called frets. And for those of you who do or do not know guitars, I'm looking around for a guitar. Frets are the little lines on the neck of a guitar that show you where to place your fingers. And that really changed the way you played the instrument, because now anybody could kind of pick it up and play a tune without having to be very specific. It's like the difference between playing a violin, which has no frets, and a ukulele, which has frets. One's very difficult, one's a lot easier. Well, the lute became so popular that anybody who made lutes was called a luthier. It became its own profession. And even today, anybody who makes guitars, we still call them luthiers because of the history of creating the lute. Now, throughout medieval Renaissance times, the lute became a very popular instrument in paintings, in art, in sculpture. You'll see here there's Caravaggio, Vermeer featured it as well. It became a centerpiece of music throughout Europe, primarily because it could be carried around, and minstrels would sing and play and entertain people in towns. It also became a parlor instrument, which could be played in small gatherings. The lute was very, very predominant until the Crusades. And while this is not a picture of the Crusades, since there were no pictures, I think anybody of a certain age will appreciate the fact of Monty Python searching for the Holy Grail under the guise of the Crusades. The Crusades were meant to drive the Moors, who were Muslims, out of the Iberian Peninsula, in fact, out of all of Europe. And when they did that, when they drove the Moors back into Africa, the resulting fallout for the musical instrument community was pretty intense because the lute, which was a derivation of the oud, looked a lot like the oud. And there was a concern, and I'm going to give you two stories here. But first is there was a concern that the Spanish no longer wanted to create an instrument or build an instrument that looked like the oud because it was a symbol of their Spanish oppressors. They thought, well, every time we pick this up, it reminds us of those people we finally drove out. We've got to come up with a different shape. We've got to come up with a different way to play this instrument. And so the two stories, one of which is, well, the luthier guilds got together and said, we need a new shape. How do we change that oval back shape and make it something that's uniquely Spanish? Well, they got together and said, the most important Spanish thing that we know of is the Spanish woman. So perhaps we should celebrate the Spanish woman and all that she represents. And so there was the thought that here you have the guitar, and it's shaped somewhat like a woman's shape. You've got shoulders, it curves into a waist, and then goes out to form hips. And we still call parts of the guitar shoulders, waist, and hips. Now that's all a lovely story in that it pays homage to the Spanish woman. But the reality is that before there was such a thing as ergonomics, the guitar was, or the lute was a very hard thing to play. As you can see the round back, when you put it on your lap, it tends to slip. It's like, think about putting a big round bottomed pot on your lap. It'll slip out. Same thing with putting your arms around it. And oud is very big. You've got to kind of reach all the way over the top. The idea might have come about that if we put a notch in the bottom of the guitar so that you can rest it on your knee, perhaps it'll stop sliding off of your knee and your lap. And if we put a matching notch over the top, there's a place for you to put your forearm and your elbow. So the design perhaps came about because of the need for ergonomics and better ease of playing. The story about creating it in the shape of the Spanish woman is a nice story, and it gives us a good history, but the reality is probably closer to the fact that it made a better sense to make an instrument shaped like this than one that was that teardrop shape of the oud. So from this point forward, from the 1400s forward, all guitars and almost all stringed instruments took on this shape. And the first instruments were called vihuelas, and they were also made in the Iberian Peninsula. And you can see here how they evolved into really the shape that we consider the guitar to be today. There are variations of it, but they were certainly the shape, as it were, of things to come. Now, that was instruments called the vihuela, but the name guitar, it's not known specifically when the guitar name was applied to the instrument we use today. The variation of guitars has been around for thousands of years. You have the chitarra in Greece, you have chitarra in Latin, you have guitar in Arabic, you have guitar in English, you have guitar in German, all those things. It wasn't really until the 1800s that the standard form of the word guitar started being used throughout Europe. And it was also at that same time, around the 1800s, that the guitar became primarily a 6-string instrument. And we have an instrument in the exhibition from 1806, which is one of the very first 6-string guitars ever made. It was made when Thomas Jefferson was president. There are only 17 of them left in the world, but you can see when you look at it in the exhibit how that shape has come to define everything that we know about the guitar going forward. Once the world settled on the idea of what a guitar really was in the 1800s, it became popular, much as the lute had been popular in Europe, became popular in small gatherings, especially parlors. And interestingly enough, it was played primarily by women. It was a small enough instrument. It was easy to handle, and again, as I mentioned, easy to carry around. Men tended to play horns and drums and keyboards. But the guitar, unlike today, was very much an instrument because of its size that was performed by women, especially in the home. But as it spread a little bit further from the home, as its popularity increased, it was included in bands. And as you can see here, we've got a military band, mostly of banjos and of two small guitars there. If you've ever heard a banjo band play, it's incredibly loud and incredibly racket making. The guitar at the time was not very loud and could not really be heard above the banjo or even trumpets or pianos and drums. One of the reasons for its enduring popularity in the home was because you could use it as a sing-along and it wasn't competing with the sound from other instruments. So even as it moved out from the home and into the public, it had a problem with the volume. And part of the problem with the volume was that it was a small body, the guitars were small bodied, and the size of the body, especially the top, determines how much volume is going to be forced away from the guitar, how much air pressure is driven by the strings in the top. But also, and this is something we talk about a lot in the exhibit, strings were made of catgut. And at the time, catgut was a really popular material through the 1700s, 1800s, even into the early 1900s. Catgut was used for strings, it was used for making sutures, for surgical sutures, stitches, tennis rackets, archery bowstrings, almost anything that we would use, say, plastic wire or twine for today. And most people think the name catgut involves exactly what you're seeing here, cats and their intestines, but that's not the case. Sheep intestines are catgut. Sheep and goat intestines are called catgut. And it's a misnomer, obviously, we don't call them sheep intestines. But because of their popularity, hundreds of years ago, people used to carry around strings. Musicians carried around kits of sheep intestine strings. Doctors carried around kits of sutures. And so these became known as kit guts. And at some point amongst all of the years that have transpired, kit gut became catgut. So having a kit of gut is now known as catgut. Catgut strings are still used very rarely by classical players, but they're still made from sheep intestines. But mostly they've been replaced by nylon strings, which also helps to make the guitar louder. And being louder was really important. As I showed you earlier, you've got very loud instruments that are playing around the guitar. It wasn't until metal wire was used for strings and guitar bodies got bigger that the guitar started to be able to compete with stand-up basses and banjos and keyboards. It really all changed in the 1840s when a gentleman named Christian Frederick Martin came up with a way to build a big guitar body with a big front, that's the soundboard, the front part that you see when somebody's playing, that would vibrate so well that it would really create this loud sound. It would move a lot of air forward. And that really changed the way we think of the acoustic guitar. And to this day, Martin probably makes the loudest guitars. Martin is one of the oldest family-run and family-owned businesses in America. It's coming up on 200 years of ownership. And the guitar, that acoustic guitar, really allowed instruments to be played alongside mandolins and banjos and all the other things I've mentioned. But it did result in some very odd guitars. On the lower right here, you'll see a harp guitar, which we have a version of in the exhibit, which is this monstrously huge guitar with nearly 20 strings, and was almost impossible to hold in your chest, but it was really loud because it had so many strings. It had this big string, it had this big body, but it ended up being more of a beautiful piece of furniture than an actual usable, playable instrument. So as I said, you can see ours in the exhibit, which is from 1912. This is a little bit more of the information. The Martin Dreadnought today is that shape that Martin came up with is really the standard that even all these decades later, we still think of as being the shape of the acoustic guitar. Side note, it's called the Dreadnought. It was called that because it was named after the most feared battleship in the world, which were the British dreadnoughts. Bit of trivia that you won't necessarily find in the exhibit. But as I said, it's a bigger body. This first We have both of these guitars in the exhibit. The one on the left is the Dreadnought. The one on the right is the 1806 guitar that is one of the very first 6 strings. And you can see the difference in size. You can see why a bigger guitar with more body surface area would be much louder than a guitar that's that small, almost ukulele sized with catgut strings. Now, the increase in the size of the acoustic guitar was all well and good until 1915. And in 1915, the Pan-Pacific International Exposition was held in San Francisco. And that was really just kind of a World's Fair. It was to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. And it was a set of pavilions where people were invited from all over the world, countries were invited from all over the world to show their wares and kind of do what you do at a World's Fair. But the big hit at the pavilion was the Hawaiian bands. And this was before Hawaii became part of the United States. But by far, its popularity outshone that of every other country and region in the world. And Americans flocked to San Francisco to listen to this music. And within a year, Hawaiian music became the most popular form of music in America. And it stayed that way from 1915 till the beginning of World War II, till basically 1941. So over all that time, Hawaiian music was more popular than jazz and folk and country and classical, more sheet music, more concerts. Everything that had to do with music was headed towards buying and listening to Hawaiian music. Now, in a Hawaiian band, you've got a lot of singers, you have a keyboard player, you have some horn players, and you have a lot of drums. You also have guitar players, and guitars in a Hawaiian band are played on the lap, and that's called lap steel guitar playing. So instead of playing it like we all know Spanish guitar, it's played flat down and you put your fingers down here and you play it this way. That tends to not only keep the volume down, but it almost kind of obscures the guitar from the audience because it's on somebody's lap and there are people around the guitarist. Well, there was a gentleman named George Beecham, who was actually an American, he was born in Texas, who led his own Hawaiian band, because Hawaiian bands, once they get popular, were adapted by Americans and Europeans to play their own versions of that. So Beecham had his own band, and a lot of Hawaiian bands found themselves immediately going from playing these very small stages to playing theaters, and in some cases amphitheaters. And that was all well and good for everybody on stage except for the guitar player. And the guitar player, again, not the loudest instrument, but certainly having it in your lap makes it even less able to be heard. So Beecham, who led his own band and played guitar, got very frustrated that here he is, the leader of the band, can't hear himself play. People are applauding, he doesn't know if they're applauding for him, and it's his band. So you've got an example here of the kinds of people that were in, or kinds of musicians and dancers that were in a Hawaiian band. And you can see a couple of them in the front row playing guitar. One actually has a Spanish style, but they're competing with a lot of more powerful instruments. So Beecham, who was an inveterate tinkerer, came up with the idea of putting magnets over the top of his guitar. And his guitar was shaped like this. We call it the frying pan. And what happens with magnets is if you put magnets over the top of anything metal, the pieces of metal, you can try this actually when you put two magnets together. They'll either attract to each other or they'll repel. Now, if you take a piece of metal, same thing will happen. It'll cause the magnetism, the electromagnetism around a magnet to vibrate. It breaks that magnetic field. And so by using an electromagnet plugged into an electrical source, he was able to pick up the vibrations from strings made of metal that could then be turned into sound signals and sent from these magnets out to a speaker. And in his case, back then, there were no amplifiers, the only speakers were in radios. So he plugged it into these big radios that were popular in the 30s. And for the first time, he could hear himself just by turning up the radio. So the electrical impulses that came from this magnet going down through a copper wire into a big speaker now allowed him to control the power of the guitar in a performance setting. And at this point, his first prototype was 1931. The guitars were actually then sent for production in 1932. We have number 11 off the first full production line, which was 1934. So when you come in to the exhibit, you'll see the frying pan, which is aluminum. It's very bright and very silver. And it looks nothing like a guitar, but it's the reason for the creation of the modern electric guitar. It wasn't because of country music, it wasn't because of rock and roll, it wasn't because of jazz, but it was the creation of the electric guitar came about because Hawaiian musicians could not hear themselves. It also helped that the Rural Electrification Act, which came about 2 years after production of this guitar started, allowed guitarists to be able to go through the country and plug into radios that were in juke joints or restaurants or small bars. They could finally amplify their guitars to the point where now the guitar is going to be the loudest instrument in the world for the rest of history. There is no instrument louder than a plugged-in guitar turned up to 10 or 11. They can get as loud today as 747 turbines. So Beecham created an instrument that went from being the one that couldn't be heard in the back of the band to being the world's loudest instrument. So, as I said, Hawaiian musicians applied this to their performances, but you had jazz musicians, you had country musicians who also realized that this was a big step forward and wanted to take advantage of the same thing. Well, the lap steel guitar, as I said, is played in your lap. You can't pick it up and play it this way. It's just not designed that way. So that changed when a country player named Merle Travis, who had seen all these Hawaiian players get their guitars nice and loud, went to a motorcycle mechanic named Paul Bigsby and said, hey, if I give you one of these lap steel things, do you think you can figure out a way to use the electronics and turn it into a guitar that I can play like my Spanish guitar? And Merle Travis was a hugely popular country player, also very influential as a guitarist himself. He came up with a style of guitar playing that we still use today called Travis picking. But he took it to Paul Bigsby, and Bigsby fiddled around and came up with what is arguably the first guitar that looks like what we think of as the electric guitar. It's this very familiar shape. You hold it like this, which is how you hold a Spanish guitar. They were even called ES, electric Spanish guitars, when this generation of guitars was first made. But we look at this as being really the prototype for all guitars to come, and it was done by a motorcycle mechanic. But Bigsby liked being a motorcycle mechanic. He liked playing with devices and gears and springs and sprockets, and didn't want to continue making these kind of guitars. But other guitarists who saw Merle Travis play were like, well, we want more of these. We want our own. And so another person in Merle Travis's orbit, who also knew Paul Bigsby, was a gentleman named Leo Fender. Leo Fender was a radio and TV repairman who had lots of customers who brought in their Hawaiian guitars to him and said, can you fix this? The cable snapped or the pickup's loose. Can you help me out? He would routinely fix those, but he felt like they could be made better. And he was also in Southern California at a time when the Bakersfield country music sound was becoming popular. And so he had lots of his clients saying, we'd really like a guitar like Paul Bigsby's from Merle Travis. How do we get one of these that we can afford and that we can play on stage? Well, Leo went about creating one. He basically took kind of the shape of Paul Bigsby's, used some different electronics, and came up with something that was called initially the Broadcaster and is today called the Telecaster. The name comes from the 1940s and the first idea of television and ultimately the space race and things happening out in the universe. And This guitar is the Telecaster, which you will see one of in the exhibit, is the first mass-produced electric guitar. Paul Bigsby's was a one-off, he did a few, but the first mass-produced off an assembly line kind of guitar was the Telecaster. And it was introduced in 1949, and that's over half a century ago. And that guitar has not changed at all in the way it looks and feels since then. Now, one great thing, let's see if I got one before it. One great thing about Leo Fender, I'm going to go back one more. This gentleman, as I said, was a radio and TV repairman. Today, his name is on more electric guitars than any other person in the history of the planet. As a matter of fact, just this year during the pandemic, Fender guitars had their best year ever. More people bought guitars this year from Fender than they've ever done in the past. So there are millions upon millions of guitars with Leo Fender's name on them. The great thing about that story is that Leo Fender never learned how to play the guitar. Never. Didn't even know how to tune one. He was apparently tone deaf. But for the man whose name is on more guitars than anybody else in history, never learned how to play the guitar. And you know what? It's never too late. So any of you who don't play, please don't think it's too late. You can always do it. A lot of people think Les Paul, especially people in our age group, think Les Paul invented the electric guitar. And that's certainly not true. Les Paul did play a guitar. Les Paul did come up with an idea in 1941 for a type of electric guitar. And Les was an inveterate tinkerer. He actually came up with the idea of sound on sound and multi-track recording so that you could record individual instruments one at a time, as we do today in recording studios. Prior to that, everybody in a band, whether they were an orchestra or a small trio, had to be recorded all at the same time. If somebody messed up, you had to start over. With the invention of track-by-track recording or sound-on-sound recording, you could record the drums, then you could record the bass, then you could record the guitar, then you could record the vocals. All of them could have their own track and it could be modified, and each track could be modified individually. So Les was an incredible inventor. And he came up with this idea for a guitar where he took a 4x4, basically a railroad tie, and put magnets in it, similar in a way to George Beecham had done, put a guitar neck on it, and went to Gibson Guitar, which was an acoustic guitar maker, and said, I have this thing, he calls it the log. It'll be great. It's an electric, it makes a guitar electric. And he showed it to a lot of people, and they said, Gibson alone said, you know, we don't think this electric guitar thing is going to work. We think it's a fad. We really don't think it's going to last. And also the band that Les was in, the band leader said, you're not playing that. It's too ugly. You can't put that in our band. We're an upscale band. You cannot do that. And Les said, well, what if I put pieces of a guitar around it and make it look more like a regular guitar? And that worked for the band leaders, but it did not work for Gibson Guitar. So Les did not invent the guitar. He came up with an idea for one, but it was never actually put into production. Now, a few years after Leo Fender's Telecaster in 1951, Gibson Guitar said, maybe this thing isn't such a fad anymore. Maybe there's more of this electric guitar thing than we thought. So they created their own guitar, which looked, as you look at it here, very, very similar to the original Merle Travis guitar made by Paul Bigsby, and not too dissimilar from the Telecaster. And so they created it and said, well, we need somebody to endorse it. And at that time, Les Paul was an incredibly popular performer, not only on stage, but he had a TV show and a radio show with his then wife, Mary Ford. So they said, would you endorse this guitar? And Les said, yes, but I want you to make sure it's always painted gold so that it looks much more expensive than Leo Fender's guitar. So that's Les Paul's contribution to the world of the electric guitar. You'll see a gold electric guitar, a gold Les Paul in the exhibit, but Les Paul, if you learned anything today, Les Paul did not invent the electric guitar. Now I'm going to finish out with some getting close to the modern era. I can't see you and you can't reply to me, but I'm guessing that everybody watching this knows what that shape is. For those of you who don't, and I don't believe there are anybody who I don't believe anybody doesn't know what this shape is. It's the Coca-Cola bottle. It's said that this shape is the single most recognizable man-made silhouette in the world. You go anywhere in the world and you show somebody this shape, they're going to say, oh yeah, that's a Coke bottle. Apparently, the second most recognizable shape is this. Now, everybody here knows that's an electric guitar. You might not know what kind of electric guitar it is, but you know it's an electric guitar. And apparently, you can do the same thing with that you did with the silhouette of the Coke bottle and show it to anyone anywhere in the world, and they will recognize that as an electric guitar. Most people don't realize that that's actually the Fender Stratocaster. The Fender Stratocaster, which is really the definitive shape of the guitar, was crafted in 1954 in Leo Fender's shop. It came about as a need for something a little bit more stylish than his Telecaster. It also had curvier sides that conformed to the shape of the rib cage, so that it didn't kind of eat into an abdomen or chest of the player. And it frankly, it looked a lot cooler, and especially in the 50s as Southern California surf and car culture was becoming popular, this was the right guitar for the time. You'll also notice that it's red. Every other guitar I've shown you up until now, every oud, every Nayatiti, every lute was all wood grain or wood colored, maybe stained, maybe finished, but never painted a bright color like this. And one of the things that Leo Fender and his associates realized is that to sell this guitar into the current music culture, which I said was the beginning of surf culture, they adapted the look and theme of the California car culture. And what they did was they bought excess paint, automotive paint, from companies like DuPont, and painted all of their stock in colors that were already on popular cars, especially muscle cars in Southern California. So you have Candy Apple Red and Dakota Red and Fiesta Red and Graffiti Yellow and Lake Placid Blue, and there was Seafoam Green and all kinds of other colors. But even today, if you get an old guitar from the 1950s and early 60s, an old Fender, and need to paint it, you actually go to the DuPont automotive catalog and order the paint from an auto supply parts place, because that's where all those colors came from. And that color system really changed guitars to the point that, you know, we look at guitars and they can be all different colors. Here, we look at the three main guitars that I've talked about. There's a blue Telecaster on the left, a white Les Paul in the middle, and a red Stratocaster. It's really interesting that all of these guitars were made in the late 1940s and early 1950s. After that period of time, you have all these kind of cool looking, some not so cool, and odd looking guitars that have come about over the last 40 years. And they've got all kinds of different shapes and colors. But these three that I showed you are still the definitive shapes and the definitive brands after, you know, more than half a century. So while you'll see all of these in the exhibit as well, and explanations for why they're important and who used them, it's those three primary guitars, the Telecaster, the Les Paul, and the Stratocaster, that are the ones that we think of today. And one of the reasons that is, and here, this is my final point, is that when they were released in the Telecaster in 1949, the others in the 1950s, think about what else was in the world in terms of design, in terms of appliances that we used. You know, think of the phone from the 1950s. You know, that's not anything similar in any way, shape, or form to the iPhone or the Android that you're using today. Somebody from the 1950s would not recognize that instrument or that device on the right as a telephone. Same with computers. The UNIVAC and the ENIAC computers of the 1950s and 60s were room-sized computers with components as big as refrigerators. Today, we have all that power and much, much, much more on any laptop that you can buy. So the little laptop with its little screen gives us so much more power than we had in the 50s, and it also doesn't resemble it at all from a design perspective. This is true perhaps to our most popular appliance device, cars. You look at a Cadillac from the 1950s, you look at the fins, you look at the angles, you look at the chrome, just an amazing amount of metal and flourish on the car. Then you look at today's most modern Cadillac. It's sleek. All of the fins and the flash and the flare are gone. Still has its own design elements, but it's really stripped down more to be something much more utilitarian and, by our standards, something much prettier. The thing that really makes all this or drives all this home is that the Stratocaster of the 1950s, when it was introduced in 1954, is exactly the same as the Telecaster today. Other than the materials used in the electronics, it is the exact same instrument. Hasn't changed. The shape hasn't changed. The wood materials haven't changed. It's as if the Stratocaster and the Les Paul and the Telecaster were birthed perfectly when they were first designed. So here we are 70 years later, and the instrument still looks the same as it did then, which really is a testament to how well it was designed and how wildly it was embraced and popularized to the point that people don't really want anything different. There are options, but these remain the instruments that rock the world, and you'll see all of them in the exhibit. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, HP. I definitely learned a couple of things, even though I've been through the exhibition. So I'd invite you all to come on down and see it. And we do have a question.
All right.
Are you familiar with Taylor guitars? We
Yes.
toured the plant in San Diego, and they were discussing changing the X inside the board.
Yes. After the Martin guitar, which we talked about earlier, which is kind of the definitive acoustic guitar, and I probably should have explained this earlier, but acoustic guitars are any guitars that don't plug in. They just use wooden strings to produce sound. Hence the term acoustic. As a matter of fact, before the electric guitar was made, they weren't called acoustic guitars, they were just called guitars. But Martin, as I showed earlier, defined how the guitar was shaped. The Taylor Company, which is a much more recent company based in California, came up with a different way to build the acoustic guitar body. And one of the really cool things about a guitar body, and you'll see this also in the exhibit, is there's no nails or screws used to hold the body together. It's all pressure and glue. And in order to keep all that together, you use braces on the inside that keep the wood from splitting and also from the neck from pulling it apart. And Martin's bracing, that kind of wood struts that were in the inside, really defined, and still do to some degree, how acoustic guitars were built. But Bob Taylor came up with some different ideas and even moved those braces a little bit around so that he would get more vibration out of the front of the guitar and make them louder. And I actually have a Taylor guitar, which I love, and it's one of the loudest guitars I've ever played because of those modifications that the Taylor Company uses on their guitars.
Very nice. Well, I don't see any other questions yet. Feel free to ask one if you have one, and I'll stop before my ending. Thank you all for attending Senior Morning today, and a huge thank you to HP Newquist for his presentation on his exhibition. And be sure to tune in next time, Wednesday, January 13th at 10:30 a.m. when we'll be hosting Preston Jackson to hear about his special presentation of his new exhibition, the Bronzeville to Harlem piece, going in the Street Gallery. Senior Morning is generously sponsored by Kim Blickenstaff. A special thanks also goes to museum members and Visionary Society members for their continued support of virtual programming. And thank you so much, HP. It was a pleasure to hear from you again. And thank you all for joining us.
All right, thank you, Heather. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.